life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. These are the natural rights of which the Declaration of Independence invoked, setting the principles of America's very founding. Armed with this info, it is no surprise that these principles are what all Americans are known to hold so dearly. This unique value of freedom,
Get out of my way.
often criticized by the rest of the world, is what I call the American identity. Valuing those freedoms and doing everything in your power to preserve them, whether it be to benefit your own unique struggles in America or fighting for the nation as a whole, is what makes an American an American. In this video, I will delve into how the American identity came to be and cover its transformation from the colonial era to the Reconstruction, focusing mostly on how African Americans, natives, and women utilized it along the way. Keep in mind that I will use the term American freedom to refer to the unique Anglo-American definition of freedom, that being liberty rested on Lockean ideas, such as consent of the governed, free from restraint from the government, inalienable rights, stuff like that. Not only this, but just to clear up any confusion, there's a clear distinction between American citizens, meaning people who were actually officially recognized as Americans that were part of the country body politic at the time, and people who showed the American identity, which applies to people who both fought for the American idea of freedom and people who applied those ideas to be free from their own struggles regardless of whether or not they were seen as Americans at the time. With that out of the way, let's dive in. To fully understand the American identity and how it came to value liberty and freedom so much, we have to look at its origins and consider America's roots, Britain. We all know that US history is basically a better spin-off show that broke away from the British history, so of course British influence, beliefs, and values would be deeply ingrained into the nation's origins. You see, the British had a very unique definition of liberty since the very beginning. Rather than having the definition of liberty being defined by the privileges and freedoms of a particular social group like their contemporaries in Europe, Britain's experience in the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution led them to have a more unique definition of liberty. Liberty, to Brits, now rested on the belief that everyone was equal under the government and that the government should allow them to be as free from restraint as possible. Perhaps no other Brit spoke on this concept of liberty as well as John Locke, an English philosopher. His philosophical work, Two Treatises of Government, clearly defined life, liberty, and property as rights that should never be taken away by the government, and that the government's power should only be exercised by the consent of the governed. These ideas would make their way across the pond and integrate themselves deeply as values in the American colonies. These values, along with British patriotism, the idea that basically says British people were the freest people of all due to their unique definition of liberty and that all other nations were autocratic and backwards, Americans now identified themselves as Brits or Anglos that valued freedom. Now, what about the slaves? Well, even before the American Revolution, slave rebellions that sprouted from the desire for liberty still occurred. African American identity was based on the shared experience of slavery and their desire to be free from it. Their definition of liberty more so revolved around the cruel and torturous nature of slavery, and were not yet directly inspired by the Anglo-American and British definition, which revolved around the government as a whole. This is clearly demonstrated by the Stono Rebellion, where slaves that had just previously arrived from the Congo seized weapons and marched down to Florida, killing whites along the way. This shows that their desire for freedom still held true from the moment they were taken away from Africa, rather than being directly inspired by the American definition of liberty. The American identity, and their particular definition of freedom, however, would not resonate with other groups until... Ever since 1763, Britain's rule over the colonies started to become increasingly authoritarian. Americans did not like this, and thus they started to reject Britain as a whole and began to identify themselves as Americans. Their identity was now shaped by the resentment of everything Great Britain, something that united all American colonies. 1775 saw the start of the American Revolution, and in 1776 the Declaration of Independence was signed. The war, along with the Declaration, solidified the ideal of liberty and freedom into the American identity more than ever before. The Declaration of Independence clearly defined and implemented the Lockean ideas of freedom and inalienable rights into its founding. The fact that America's very birth was fought through a struggle for independence perfectly demonstrates how much the ideas of liberty, natural rights, and resentment of a tyrannical government were deeply rooted and valued in its identity. However, the Revolution also brought into the question of freedom and who it applied to. The institution of slavery began to come under fire more than ever before. The main driving force behind this criticism came from the apparent hypocrisy of America's emphasis on freedom and liberty, while at the same time having such a prominent institution that centered around depriving slaves of theirs. African Americans started to speak out and redefine the American definition of liberty into something more universal. Freedom petitions by African Americans perfectly demonstrate this, with one petition asking how America could seek release from English tyranny and not seek the same for disadvantaged Africans in her midst. Other African Americans, a prominent one being Phyllis Wheatley, also used this technique and incorporated it into her poems, which were published and read by many white Americans. It became clear that African Americans became inspired by the Revolution's ideologies and used it to contradict slavery. The Native Americans also experienced a similar situation. They too used the ideology of American freedom to their advantage. To Indians, their freedom rested on the liberty to govern and live peacefully on their own lands without American interference. Before the Revolution, the word freedom was not as prominent in Native American language. Only after it did Americans start to speak of natural rights and liberty. For example, Creeks and Choctaws resented American influence and stated how they did nothing to justify being stripped of their, quote, independence and natural rights. As for women, it is clear that American freedom cannot exist without the ability to have a say in government, but that ability was only limited to men at the time. Women were to be subordinate to men and were not seen as capable enough to be involved in politics, which makes it clear that they did not enjoy the full freedom and liberty that was available to white men. The Revolution did somewhat improve women's status and involvement in politics by establishing the idea of Republican motherhood, which encouraged women to train their children so that they would become better citizens when they get involved in politics in the future. Despite this, women didn't espouse revolutionary ideas to improve their role in society and to achieve the American freedom that white men enjoyed as much as slaves and natives did. Nonetheless, the syncretism of the already established patriotic American ideology of freedom and the freedom desired by slaves and natives demonstrates how the American identity was beginning to also hold true for people that weren't just white descendants of the English. The AOC, no, not that one. The AOC, or Articles of Confederation, proved to be a huge failure in implementing an effective government. Because of this, the Constitution was ratified in 1787 to take its place. The Constitution proved to overall be more effective, and one of the things it did was define who Americans really were, but through constant implicit wording. Although it never explicitly mentions race or skin color, it was clear that the words "we the people" only applied to whites. Native Americans were not U.S. citizens, and were considered a completely sovereign and separate entity, as seen by how they were described as not taxed. Slaves were only referred to as other persons, showing that they were still considered separate and lesser than whites. Not only this, but the Constitution actually allowed slavery to flourish through means such as the Three-Fifths Compromise, prohibiting Congress from banning the slave trade for 20 years, and overall ensuring the ability to police and practice the institution of slavery how they want. Because of this and the indirect wording of the Constitution, the American identity, in terms of who was considered to be an actual American, was put in a weird position. Someone could be considered an American by valuing American principles, such as liberty and freedom, since those values were what held all the people living in America together as a common identity. On the other hand, the Constitution seemed to only favor whites, and only allowed them to receive the full benefits of American freedom, thereby alienating people of different ancestry. This made it all clear that race was the main deciding factor of who was considered an American. The major proponents of this were people who defended slavery and believed that blacks were inferior. They argued that the Lockean definition of freedom and liberty, which included inalienable rights and private property, were only applicable to humans who were capable of rational thought and feelings. Because they believed that blacks were genetically inferior to whites, the benefits of freedom could not be applied to them. This, along with the argument that slaves were considered private property and thus confiscating them would be considered a violation of freedom, made it clear that only whites were granted complete freedom that Americans held dear, arguably making only them considered to be fully American. As democracy expanded, the Constitution also raised questions in regards to women and whether or not they could be involved in American politics. Again, due to its indirect wording, the Constitution never explicitly said anything regarding any rights only being limited to men, which brought into question of how much influence women had in terms of rights in politics. However, in the Constitution, office holders were referred to as he, which served as a point to only further the exclusion of women from politics. Mary Wollstonecraft, although not an American, wrote works that intensified the discussion of women's rights and status in the U.S. due to her advocacy for equal educational opportunities for women. The increasing discussion of improving women's rights and status in society shows that women were starting to fight more for the American liberty and rights that were only fully enjoyed by white men, demonstrating a value in freedom and liberty that holds true to the American identity. Apart from the Constitution, the Naturalization Act of 1790 also made it clear that only those of white ancestry were considered Americans. The Naturalization Act granted citizenship to Americans and people from abroad as long as they were white. This shows that white Americans at the time only recognized people with white skin rather than people who actually valued American freedom as fit enough to be considered an American. As America progressed, The notion that race was a major determining factor behind who was considered to be an American still thrived, but it was starting to shatter. The idea of colonization, the concept of sending Africans back to Africa, was rooted in the idea that America was a country built only for white people, and that blacks would never achieve true equality in American society. This idea was popular mostly among whites, with prominent advocates such as Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, and John Marshall. Most African Americans were opposed to this idea, however, since they argued that African Americans were just as American as everybody else, and thus deserved the same rights and freedoms. David Walker, a freed black from North Carolina, perfectly encapsulates this notion by writing, "Tell us no more about colonization, for America is as much our country as yours." This shows just how American blacks had become, not only through the desire for American freedom, but actually justifying it by claiming nationality and citizenship to the US. In the 1830s, this desire evolved into a more organized movement known as abolitionism. During this time, there were 2 million slaves alone out of 13 million total people in the US. Abolitionists believed in the eradication of not only slavery, but the eradication of racism in all forms, and that privileges and rights should not be limited to race. Abolitionists also used American revolutionary ideals to their advantage, for example, interpreting the preamble of the Declaration of Independence as anti-slavery. Another tactic was openly pointing out the hypocrisy of the United States and by opposing the claims that America was a land of freedom. Frederick Douglass, perhaps the most prominent orator and black abolitionist, asked what to the slave is the 4th of July. However, Douglass did indeed believe that America was founded on the principle of freedom and liberty, and that the founding fathers were great men for fighting for those ideas, and that by encouraging people to fight for the abolition of slavery, America can once again return to what it originally stood for. The reform movements also involved women as well. Again, American freedom rested on the idea of the government only having power with consent of the governed, which cannot exist if people have no say or influence in governing themselves. One of the rights to ensure this was of course the right to vote. But since the very founding of the nation, women were denied that right. The suffrage movement was founded with the start of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, bringing the formal discussion of women's suffrage to the table for the very first time. Elizabeth Cady Stanton used the Declaration of Independence as a model for her own book, the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. In it, she used the Declaration's rhetoric of freedom and democracy and appropriated it to the experiences and subordination of women. She added woman to Jefferson's famous "all men are created equal" line and replaced the injustices committed by King George III with injustices committed by men towards women. Not only that, but Stanton also went as far as to say that only the right to vote could make woman free as man is free. Lydia Maria Child also stated, either the theory of our government is false, or women have the right to vote, which basically means that the idea of American freedom and its emphasis on the government resting on the will of the people cannot truly live up to its name unless all people under the government, including women, were able to vote and have equal rights. By applying American freedom to equal rights among both genders, the suffrage movement showed that women were also fighting to preserve what America originally stood for, by advocating for the full benefits of freedom and liberty for women, demonstrating the American identity. The Civil War and the Reconstruction era that occurred after it immensely transformed how African Americans were viewed as American citizens forever. The Dred Scott case shed light on the issue of whether or not blacks were considered American citizens. It declared that Scott was indeed merely a slave with no rights or citizenship, unlike whites, so he was not entitled to freedom despite his residence in a free state. This event, Nat Turner's Rebellion, and many others intensified the sectional divide regarding slavery, which erupted into the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation's liberation of slaves in the South marked a turning point in the American identity. Its provision to enlist blacks to be part of the Union Army also altered the attitude about African American citizenship. Since blacks were now fighting alongside whites in the name of freedom, this altered the outlook on their role and loyalty to America. Frederick Douglass observed that, "Once let a black man get upon his person the brass letters US, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States." Towards the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was approved, and with that, slavery was finally abolished. After the Civil War, the idea of American freedom was once again debated, but this time in regard to former slaves. With slavery gone, people began to question whether or not freedom just simply meant freedom from slavery, or if it also included the right to vote, civil rights, and citizenship. Blacks began advocating for the right to vote and citizenship, as they believed that true freedom for freed slaves also meant access to all institutions of American freedom. Eventually, the 14th Amendment would come to grant citizenship to all citizens born in the United States, regardless of race, and the 15th Amendment would guarantee the protection of voting rights for Americans of any race, but not gender. These amendments changed the idea of American freedom, its privileges, and identity forever. Prior to the Reconstruction era, American citizenship and being considered American were only seen as applicable to white men, despite the fact that other groups also demonstrated this strive for freedom and liberty that is emblematic of the American identity. Nowhere prior to the Reconstruction era was the long-established notion that American freedom and identity being reserved to white men was dealt such a severe blow. Nonetheless, women were still stripped of the right to vote. The freedom of blacks resulted in the re-emergence of the suffrage movement after being in a brief hiatus during the Civil War. The Reconstruction era and its effects on the Constitution were seen as an opportunity to ignite a passion for advocacy for liberty and equality for women. The movement during this time, however, was met with little recognition, and it became more divided than ever before due to its anger regarding how the Reconstruction did nothing to give women the right to vote. Advocates like Lucy Stone, however, still remained hopeful that the 14th and 15th Amendments were a step in the right direction that would hopefully lead to universal suffrage in the future, and thus true American freedom for all. The American identity. Evaluating the freedom and democracy of which the nation was founded on and striving to fight for it took on many forms throughout the first half of its history. During the period of colonization and prior to its independence, the American identity was merely based on British freedom and ancestry, and did not yet encompass other groups. During the period of Revolution, the American identity overall rejected its British roots, while other groups, being native slaves and free women, invoked the revolutionary ideas of American freedom to remedy their own struggles, signifying that they strived for their own liberty and demonstrating the start of their Americanness. The era of the Constitution showed that being an American was regarded by their contemporaries as an identity only confined to whites, despite the fact that other groups were also demonstrating their Americanness by still holding true to the values of American freedom. The Reform movement saw the resistance to the notion that only whites were considered truly American, as African Americans began labeling themselves as American, while women fought for the right to vote. And finally, the Civil War and Reconstruction era saw the demise of American citizenship being linked to race. With its demise, anyone that demonstrated the American identity could finally officially be recognized as true Americans, as if they weren't already true Americans before. Nevertheless, the United States still has a lot of work to do to ensure that everyone, absolutely everyone, can truly enjoy at its fullest the freedom and liberty that the country was founded on. Regardless, as long as we continue to fight for those rights and ideas, we're demonstrating how American we truly are.